Thanks to folks who are joining us, and a special welcome to Kate Johnston. I'm Karin Wulf. I'm the director and librarian of the JCB, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Kate to JCB Reads, an informal conversation over Zoom about books published by former JCB fellows. It's really super fun for us to see how the time that folks spent at the JCB has had an impact on their books or their scholarship and the kind of wider scholarly world in which JCB research is swimming. So Kate Johnston is assistant professor of history at Montana State University in very beautiful Bozeman, Montana. She earned her PhD at Columbia in 2016. She's published in a variety of different places. I'll just mention Early American Studies, as well as this wonderful book from Oxford University Press, very beautifully produced too, I might add. And her work has been supported by a variety of different entities, including the Clements Library and the Newberry and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and most important of all, of course, the John Carter Brown Library. So I'm going to step off camera here and turn things over to Kate, who's going to talk about her book for 15 to 20 minutes. Then I'll jump back on for a conversation, and then we'll have space for some Q&A with Kate. Over to you, Kate.
Sure. Thanks, Karin. And thank you and Gianna. And I wanted to talk a little bit about my book today and sort of how I came to this and some of the questions I wanted to answer, and talk a bit about the book, obviously. So in terms of how I conceptualized this book, I just wanted to lead with that, right? Which is that I was sort of interested in the development of concepts of race, right? This was sort of the kind of big question I began with. And I was an early grad student at the time and started reading a bunch of secondary literature, and most of it suggested that around the late 18th and early 19th centuries, with the emergence of things like anatomy and biology, scientists in Western Europe just started dividing people into categories based on race, right? And so it seemed to me that maybe these ideas emerging from Western Europe about race must have come from people's experiences with bodies in the Americas, right? Because this is a time, if you're looking at, scientists in Western Europe, these are countries that are imperial countries that have colonies in the West Indies, that have white people in these places, transplanted Africans, indigenous Americans, and more to the point, right, as I read more, some history books suggested, even if just in passing, that these societies had actually relied on enslaved Black laborers because Black bodies were better suited to labor in a hot climate. Some of these books that I read even pointed erroneously, I would argue, to particular diseases to support these arguments, right? And this was most often just like a passing comment. So I set out to investigate this, right? I'm like, is that true? Is that how we came to racial slavery? Is that how we came to race? Like, how did this happen? So I thought, okay, well, this argument that we had, Black slavery in these American colonies because of suitability for the climate of Black bodies, right? That this would only hold water if slaveholders actually observed health differences between white and Black bodies. If they did, I would pursue this argument. So I thought, well, how do I figure out what slaveholders observe? And I went to the archives and I found troves of letters written by slaveholders and mostly managers for absentee planters. And they comment extensively on people's health, particularly on the health of enslaved Black laborers. But even though I kept looking for the place where they would talk about health differences between white and Black bodies, it wasn't there. They never said anything about that. Instead, I found a really different set of ideas. Because instead of slaveholders writing about health differences based on skin color, I found repeated and consistent writings that showed that slaveholders believed that local environments, and especially the weather, determined people's health. Letter after letter explained that rainy weather had caused bouts of sickness among enslaved populations, right? So you'd get letters like these. There's people are sick because of the rains. The rains make people sick. The people are sick because of the rains. And although plantation managers wrote most frequently about the health of enslaved populations, I also found repeated comments that rain had caused illness among both Black and white populations in the Caribbean, right? Sort of, we've had the rains, it caused much sickness. The rain makes white and Black people sick. The white and Black people are sick. And sometimes they would even say, right, like that actually Black people were getting sicker because they were more exposed to wet weather. So the question then was for me, how did we get from letters that overwhelmingly drew like no differences in bodily health between Black and white populations, and indeed consistently wrote about the poor health of Black populations, which is consistent also with account books that talk about how enslaved Black populations are like always getting sick and dying. How do we get from there to the argument that Black people were healthier than white people and that this somehow justified white enslavement of Black people? So I don't have time to go into all of the pieces here, obviously, but I want to briefly outline a few aspects of my findings and my arguments in this book. So essentially what I found was a history of colonists, planters, and slaveholders using a rhetoric of climate, using a language of climate to justify, advocate for, and demand African slavery in the Americas. So very briefly, right, I found this climatic language exists, and it's kind of this ancient idea, and then how it gets applied to racial slavery, and then it becomes accepted as a general principle. So in brief, what happened in this first part about climatic language development is that over the 17th and 18th centuries, British colonists in the Caribbean and what became the American South developed a language of climate that drew on ancient theories that helped shape an idea that hot climates were dangerous for Europeans. And in the book, I go into sort of how this happened and why it happened. And the evidence shows that they did this even though it was just a rhetorical tool, right? It wasn't something that like they were using this language of hot climate in a particular way. And it's not even to say that this is sort of a collective conscious decision at all, just that for various reasons and in various situations, this rhetoric developed and colonists began using it for their own benefit. So, for example, when people in colonial service wanted to get out of a particular assignment, they sometimes blamed hot climates for their poor health, in part because they knew it was an idea that held currency in Britain. So, to show you what I mean, there are letters like this one, right? I want to go to England. I desire leave from, alleging it's for the recovery of my health. So here, Charles Cox alleges that he needs to return to England for the recovery of his health because he doesn't like other circumstances of his situation. But he uses a language of health, knowing it's more acceptable and plausible excuse for his return than simply a dislike of his situation. And he wasn't the only one. There are other letters from various colonies suggesting that this was a fairly common excuse. So I'm thinking about like in, I think it's 1699, William Beeston, he's a governor of Jamaica, and he keeps sending these letters saying, I need to be recalled because the climate doesn't suit my health. And these letters make it to the different offices. And someone in the Treasury says, what if we pay him more instead? And so they say, what if we just pay you more instead? And he's like, oh yeah, that's fine. I'm good. I'm fine. You can pay me more. I'll stay here. Right. So this kind of thing develops over time where white people are using this idea about hot climates being dangerous to secure other ends. So the most organized way in which this happened was actually in the colony of Georgia during the 1730s and 40s. And so Georgia is founded in the early 1730s, and the founders explicitly banned slavery and all Black people from the colony. And all kinds of political maneuvering happens. But particularly, this one group of agitators forms. It's led by these two guys, they're brothers-in-law. And they argue that first, that the colony is going to fail without slavery, specifically without Black slavery, because it's not economically viable to pay white people to do this work. And this argument fails to win over people in charge of the colony. And I kind of love this image. And partly because it's this sort of imaginary thing about what Georgia must look like. You can see some sort of palm trees and also the snow-capped mountains, which obviously looks a lot like Georgia. And so the idea is that like Native people and white people are going to harmoniously work together. And they get to the colony and the white people are like, in South Carolina, they use enslaved Black people, so we would like to do that too. After repeatedly claiming that this isn't going to be economically viable, they change their tactics and they start saying it's impossible for white people to labor in this climate. Now, there's all kinds of evidence against this, right? There's plenty of evidence of white people actually laboring in this climate. And there's evidence of these ringleaders of this group having ulterior motives in their plans for slavery. But I can get into that later or not. But eventually, after almost 2 decades of complaining, the control of the colony reverts to Parliament and Black slavery is allowed. So this is for reasons of economic viability, right? Because they're like, nobody is going to this colony because of what's happening there. Everyone's going to South Carolina instead. But what happens is, like 40 years later, even 30 years later, people start writing these like extensive colonial histories. This is the history of the British Empire. And they start explaining that slavery becomes necessary in Georgia because of the climate and white people can't labor there. Now, that's not what happened, but that becomes the accepted explanation. And the timing of this is interesting because these histories come out, and this other place where these histories come out 1770s, 80s, 90s. And also what happens in the 1780s is you get in Congress, but also in Parliament, especially, debates over the transatlantic slave trade and the future of the slave trade. And this is the other place where arguments about Blackness and climate kind of begin to solidify. So Parliament's holding these hearings, and they solicit testimony from all kinds of people involved in the slave trade, and this includes planters. So planters would write in a series of answers to some questions. And for example, this one prominent planter, he's an absentee planter, archdeacon. He has a couple plantations in Jamaica. And he writes to his friend and manager, Simon Taylor, and says, so, for these hearings on the slave trade, which you obviously support continuing, can you tell me, there's this question about white plowmen in the Caribbean. Can white people use a plow? Is that a good way to kind of prepare fields? And Taylor knows that what he writes to Archdeacon is going to be shared with Parliament. So he writes, I know of no white plowing man working by themselves. Maybe they can hold it the first day for half an hour or so, but it not even for a full hour, right? Like this is basically impossible. No white people can do this, maybe half an hour. So this is in 1789 during these hearings. Parliament continues to, elects to continue the trade. And a few years later, Simon Taylor, this same guy, finds himself in need of a plowman. So he writes to his friend Archdeacon and says, it will be necessary for you to send out a good plowman if you can get one that has been used to plowing with cattle. The people we want are those that have been bred up heartily in the country on poor meager fare and being used to work hard and get up early. So we prefer Scotch young lads to any others. So so it turns out, right, it's actually not about whiteness or blackness at all. And race doesn't seem to factor in here. Instead, it seems as though the qualifications for plowing is being used to work hard and having a poor diet. So in other words, very difficult living conditions. And Scotland's climate is obviously nothing like Jamaica's. And Taylor is hardly going to pay for someone to come all the way from Scotland to Jamaica to hold the plow for half an hour, right? Like that's not going to happen. So what happens next, just because I'm speeding through here and I'll get back to this. So during these hearings, though, on the slave trade, representatives from plantation colonies sort of unequivocally say only Black people can labor in hot climates, right? White people cannot, they absolutely cannot perform this labor. And those with an interest in preserving slavery made these arguments not because they accorded with their experience, but for their own economic benefit. But the legacy of all this is significant, right? So first, to return to what I was talking about earlier with Georgia, colonial histories written around this time start using the climatic argument not so much to continue to justify African slavery in the Americas, but to explain it, essentially pretending that the climate theory was an origin story. And there's a lot of evidence to prove that this wasn't the case at all. So like I mentioned, histories of Georgia did this, and so did histories of British colonies in general. And from the outside, even though a place like Georgia manipulated the climatic argument to serve their own economic purposes, from the outside, the story seemed to confirm that this region is too hot for white people to work the land themselves. And then this story gets applied retroactively to the Caribbean as well. So second, sort of in the legacies of all of this, is in the 19th century US, pro-slavery advocates in Southern plantation societies insist that Black bodies can endure hot climates while white bodies cannot, right? Especially as we're leading up to the Civil War. And this rhetoric becomes increasingly divisive during the period leading up to the Civil War. And Black activists point out that slavery and climate actually have very little to do with each other in any kind of natural sense, right? That slavery exists, they're like, slavery exists in all latitudes. Cotton grows in other places in the world without slave labor. Some places that had slavery once upon a time have abolished it. And slaveholders are actually, they say, right, the Black activists say, making a conscious decision to hold enslaved people, and there's actually nothing natural about it. And they're like, white people can labor in hot places, and they do. Look at Cuba. So actually, and then what happens that I sort of love is right after the war, the Southern states who are now, there's slavery is abolished, they're desperate for laborers. They try to reverse these claims, and they're like, these are completely made up by people in the North who are our enemies. They are completely untrue. I don't know how anyone could possibly say that white people can't work in these climates. They totally can. It's fabulous to work here. We are recruiting white workers. And this was just made up as an argument to spite us by Northerners. So, right, but by the time they do that, this language of climate and slavery and nature has become pretty ubiquitous. And the implication is that if each body only suited a particular climate, then those bodies must also be different internally. So finally, and then most problematically, really, is that in the long term, historians took these arguments seriously. So that even today, books published right now will explain that the reason American and Caribbean colonies used enslaved Black labor is that Black people were healthier than white people in warm climates. But this is wrong on so many levels and for so many reasons. But people continue to accept it as factual without questioning what this actually does, which is two things. It A, obscures the truth, which is that self-interested planners fabricated this claim 150 years after the fact. And B, it excuses to some extent white slaveholders on the grounds that forcing Black people to labor was somehow more justifiable because it's biologically grounded and it's about bodies, not about racism. But this is just wrong. I can talk more about specifics, like arguments about malaria and yellow fever if people are interested, but I know I've taken up a lot of time here. So in brief, the result of all this is that over time, arguments that white people could not labor in hot places and that these places required Black laborers became not just an excuse, but an explanation for racial slavery. And then the result is a validation and a deepening of the idea that Black and white bodies are fundamentally different from one another. Because if bodies respond to different climates in different ways, there must be something like a deep binary racial formulation. So that's my spiel for now. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kate. That's great. I am, yeah, that was really great. I'm so struck by so many things here, but I'm going to go with the order of questions that we that we proposed and ask you. You mentioned that the origins of this project were in part because you just had a curiosity, like you just wanted to know something. You were kind of pulling on a kind of explanatory thread in the scholarship and in the kind of broader discourse about the racialization of labor and justifications for racial slavery. But I wondered if you could just like talk about that a little bit more, like walk us through how this actually worked.
Sure. Well, I was in, I've been to a few different graduate schools. And so I was in one graduate school and starting applications for a different graduate school. And as I was starting these applications, I had to check so many boxes, and there were all these different boxes. And it was partly applications for graduate school, and it was also a few other things. I can't even remember what for, but it was like you had to check all these boxes. And I'm like, why is it that people think they're going to know more about me if they know, my race and my gender and my religion and like all of these different things? Like, why is it that we are obsessed with categorizing people in this way? And so it began to really bother me as I was filling out all these applications that they all have all these boxes to check for all of these different categories. And so I started thinking about just the way we categorize bodies, and why is it that we as a society feel the need to categorize bodies in this way when everything I feel like we know, and certainly everything I had learned in graduate school up to that point, told me that this was all a social construct or that there's a spectrum, right? That you can't just like put people into these boxes, and that doesn't work. And yet we continue to do this in all of these different ways. And in some ways I get it. And in other ways I'm like, but how is it that we decided that we need to categorize bodies in this way? And so that's kind of what led me to, I can't investigate every single piece of the categorization, but let me start with race because that's a big one. Yeah.
Mm, yeah. Was there like a moment where you thought a place to do this would be this explanation about climate and about the impact of climate? Like, was there a moment where you felt like, okay, this is a kind of origin story that I can dig around in?
I think that I was at this point in my first year, or finishing my first year of the third graduate school. Yeah,
that's a story too.
I know. So it was when I was at American that I was applying for Columbia that I was doing all this stuff. So then when my first year at Columbia, I was, I'd been doing all this reading, and then I thought, okay, well, if it's true that this is a kind of a late 18th, early 19th century thing, then it should be based on observation, because I would
Yeah.
read all these books about the development of sciences around bodies. So I'm like, well,
Yeah.
maybe it has to do with different bodies in different places. And then I came
Right.
across this argument about the climate. So I was like, well, can that really be true? Right. And
Right.
so,
Did they even think that? Right. Were
yeah,
they even in this kind of like, was racist science like origin in there? Yeah.
yeah. And so, and then of course I did something you should really never do, which is do a dissertation based on a yes or no question, right? Like the answer is no, right? But then it became, I mean, it wasn't quite that
There's more to
simple.
it than that, but yes. Yeah.
Yes. But I think it was just the reading and coming across these things and thinking that, okay, if that is the case, then where's the evidence for it? And I wasn't
Hmm.
seeing any evidence in what I was reading. So I thought, well,
Mm.
let me go find this evidence.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
And
there's another question to be asked too about um, just the chronology of the study because it's long. Like you go all the way. You by the end of the book, you're at the Civil War, and talking about this kind of impact. I think you talked about that in your brief introduction to the book. But um, did you have a sense that this was going to be a kind of big chronology? Yeah.
not at all. I was absolutely like solidly 18th century. And sort of second half of the 18th century. And that was it. And I wasn't going
Mm,
beyond that in either direction. And then I kind of crept earlier because I was like, well, if I want to understand the origins of this, I have to go back to an earlier period. So that
mm,
brought me into the earlier 18th century. And it was a question that Karin Kupperman posed during my orals, where she was like, why do you think they didn't have slavery in Georgia? And I was like, they
mm,
didn't have slavery in Georgia? And that kind
yeah.
of became the base for this whole thing.
Yeah.
And then thinking about going back into the 17th century. And then the 19th century part I wrote by accident, because I had sort of had this sense of I'd gotten readers' reports back from Oxford, and I thought, okay, in the summer, this was in the fall, and I thought next summer I'm going to do these reports. And by the time it got to the summer, I was like, oh, I think I know what I said I was going to do. And I think I said I needed to write another chapter. So I'm gonna really work on this. And so
Mm,
I did, I spent months writing this other chapter. And then I went back and I looked at the readers' reports, and I never said I was going to do that. And so I wrote to Susan Ferber, who was so kind and lovely about it. And I said, I accidentally wrote a sixth chapter. And she was like, well, just send it and we'll see. And
we'll
then I'm
see.
so glad that I had, because I felt
Yes.
like it
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
kind of rounded it out and capped it.
Yeah.
But no, I had no sense that I was going to be this
I know
giant.
there is a huge payoff there at the end. I mean, where you really do, it's very emphatic that if it's a yes or no question, that the last piece really is very emphatic on the no side.
Yeah. And it
Yeah.
felt really important, like it all came together there.
Yeah. I'm just going to remind folks who are joining us that you can put questions use the Q&A function. And I have a couple more basic questions to ask Kate before we open it up for you all. But I wanted to ask you about what contributions you really wanted to make with this work. Like, there's so much conversation now about the distinction, if there is one, some people think there is and some people think there isn't, between scholarship and scholarly audiences and public audiences, and whether or not we should be thinking about historiography. Obviously I'm a huge, like, historiography is everything and historiography is for everyone, and we shouldn't, like, somehow pretend that it's exclusive. Like, I think historiography for the world, but anyway, that's just me. But there is, I think, when you're writing an academic work, which this is, you have a thought about, this is the work that I am conversing with, this is the conversation I want to be in, these are the people that I want to hear me, and this is, where I want my work to have impact. What were the kinds of conversations that you were thinking about, both scholarly and also, public?
Sure. Yeah. I really, I guess there's sort of three levels to this. On one level, I felt like our field is increasingly siloed, and I I wasn't like, I never started out thinking I was going to do environmental history, and I still don't, I'm not really like, I wouldn't identify myself first as an environmental historian. Even though I had to talk about this book for an environmental history grad class the other day, but bringing together, I kind of stumbled into that, and I thought about bringing together histories of slavery and race and the environment, and bodies and labor and all of these things, kind of bringing them together, and that this isn't just sort of told from one angle, that this is kind of it, all these pieces intersect, right? And we can't think about the environment and environmental histories without thinking about race, and that actually thinking about race also, we need to think about the environment. And so these kinds of ways of bringing these different kinds of approaches together. So that's kind of one piece. And I did want to really sort of try to get at this question of the origins of racial slavery in the Americas, and specifically,
it's a big one.
Yeah, right. And specifically questions about race. And it still bothers me to this day that I will pick up a textbook and read the sentence that, British colonists in the Americas relied on enslaved Black laborers because their bodies were better suited to the climate. And it drives me
or
nuts.
Even because they thought that.
Yes,
right.
Yeah. Before they thought that, right? And
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many books I've sort of hurled across the room in disgust, because it's just this thing that's repeated over and over. And so I really wanted to get at that, and wanted to kind of try to disrupt that. In terms of popular audiences, I struggle a little bit because I was definitely writing an academic book. But I was talking about it. I was at a friend's ranch yesterday, and I was saying like, oh, I'm giving this talk, and she was like, she was like, you wrote a book? What is this book on? Can I buy it at the bookstore? I was like, you can, but you might not want to read it. Like it's an academic book, right? So she's like, well, then just tell me about it instead. And then she's like, this is fascinating, right? But I do feel like I've gotten some feedback from people who are non-scholars who are like, I so appreciate this. Probably more than scholars. So I don't think of it as like a popular audience book, but I do think of it as an idea that everyone should be kind of not, everyone should be thinking about.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's so great. And of course, like we know that people want kind of high quality, what I think of as high protein content. Like people want that, it's good for you. It's good for your brain health. And also just, I love how, your book is yet another kind of example of what I think of as the 19th century ruining the 18th century, or not ruining the 18th century per se, but getting in the way of our really understanding the 18th century through these kinds of twisted narratives. And there's so many of them. And this is such a powerful example, really incredible example. Yeah. Phew. So I wanted to ask about what you thought was the most surprising thing you came across in your research. Like, I mean, all of us who spend time in archival research have many experiences that are astonishing and many of them tedious. But I wonder if there are any that like stand out to you. Or surprising, not tedium.
Yeah. Yeah. The tedium stands out a lot too, but I think, well, there's a few things, right? I think, first of all, I went in expecting to find something that really wasn't there and found something totally different. I really expected people to be writing at least briefly about differences between Black and white people, and it really wasn't there. And I was actually pretty surprised with how much time people were spending writing about the weather and local climates, and how differently people thought about climatic nuance, right? Like it's healthy over here, but you move a mile that way, it's not healthy, right? And that the way that they're thinking about this, and that it was for all bodies. And the other thing I think was the way that there was such because I had this idea, the more I read sources, the more I was like, okay, well, this is, the ideas that people are saying, that people are writing about that have nothing to do with black and white bodies. And then there's this disconnect, right? That you've got nobody's writing about this in their personal correspondence, but in the public material, it's all about, oh, you need black laborers in these climates. And what surprised me was when I found such blatant and obvious examples of how this had been obfuscated, like the Simon Taylor letter, right? So he's like, it's impossible for white people to do this. And then 5 years later, he's like, hey, I need a white person to do this. And so finding that kind of thing, and like with Georgia, there's all these letters, all this material that sort of says, right, that these guys, these two brothers-in-law who are saying we need slavery, they're doing it for ulterior motives, but the people writing those also had their own ulterior motives in maintaining like a slave-free Georgia. And so I was like, well, they're saying this, but it's sort of, how do I determine? But then I started finding letters that kind of explicitly detailed the cases, right? Like one guy had a brother in St. Kitts and a brother in Bristol, and they were involved in the slave trade. And so he wants to be the third brother who's in Georgia, who's going to facilitate this slave trade. Meanwhile, his brother-in-law goes out as a physician, and he like abandons his plot, and he's like, well, I'm going to treat all these people, but they can't afford to pay me. So when he presents this petition and says all these people have signed and said that they want to have slavery in Georgia, it turns out that those people were in debt to him for medical practice, and he essentially used that debt to coerce their signatures. And some of this, like I remember sitting in the National Record Office in Edinburgh in Scotland and finding a letter from just this like random sort of not very good speller merchant who was in colonial Georgia writing to his uncle. He had gone out to try to be a merchant there. And he's like explaining all that is happening. And he's interested in having slavery because he thinks that that will boost the economy of the colony. But he's like, this is what this guy has been doing. And this is what this guy has been doing. And it's all spelled out. And I'm like, so
thank you.
Exactly. It's like, thank you for that. Like I suspected this, but now I have it from sort of a disinterested party that this is all happening. And so I don't know, it was things like that.
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. So I wondered if there was anything in particular that you found and used and found significant while you were working at the JCB.
Yeah, so a couple things. So when I was a short-term fellow in 2014, I read a lot of kind of these extended printed debates in Parliament about the slave trade, and particularly testimony from several physicians. And the way that they'd kind of do all of these maneuverings to be like, well, yeah, of course, Black people are really unhealthy and they are getting sick and dying, but it's their own fault for all these reasons, right? Or this, and so they bend over backwards to try to explain this. Or you'd have abolitionists who would be like, well, if people are, Black people are so suited to the climate, you're right, they are. They're so suited to the climate. So then why are they all dying, right? This is so you have these extended debates. And so I read a lot of that then. And then when I was a long-term fellow in spring 2019, I had found this, and I showed the image in my talk about Georgia. This image I had only come across one other place, and it was in the National Library of Scotland, and it was a broadside advertising for subscriptions so people would support the colony. But this was actually published several years later in like this thing that was supposed to be a report of the colony's progress. And so what was so great is that in addition to having such a great high quality image I could actually use in the book, it was so great to sort of see how they had kind of repurposed this because this
Mm,
pamphlet had been published several times, but I had never come across it in any other copy that had the image
mm.
that was like, this is what it's like in Georgia, as opposed to sort of, this is how we imagine it might be. This is what it's happening. And, you can see these things. So there, I mean, there were a number of things, but those stood out to me.
That's great. Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask you the obligatory question, and then I want to encourage folks who are joining us to pop questions in the chat. I know we've already got one, and it's an interesting one, but can you tell us what you are working on now? If you're following threads from, I mean, this book is pretty new. So are you continuing to follow research threads from the book? Are there other questions that you're interested in exploring?
Yeah, yes and no. So broadly speaking, yes, but more specifically, I am moving in other directions. So I'm still interested. I think of my sort of broadest interest as the history of the body, right? The history of bodies and race and labor and their responses to the climate and environment. And so kind of a history of the ways we think about the body. My current stuff is more actually about gender. And race is still in there, climate and labor and environment less so, a little bit environment because of other reasons, but I'm thinking more about visual culture and about bodies in the Atlantic world, specifically on imagery of women breastfeeding in the context of violence, which sounds a little bit bizarre, but actually there's this incredible through line of imagery of nursing women and violence that kind of goes from sort of 1505 through and continues further. And I'm still in the beginning stages of this research. Like I need to conduct research. I need to think about this, but I'm doing a lot more kind of visual analysis and expanding the scope to more leaving, I mean, a little bit still in British Empire, but looking more at the French Atlantic world, and looking at Portuguese and Spanish and more indigenous, like images of indigenous women, and then up through kind of the French and American revolutions and the Haitian Revolution. That's one where I'm still new on research. But yeah, so I'm looking at this imagery of particularly breastfeeding women and their bodies, and especially in the context of violence. And I know it's all nebulous, but
It's so interesting. Like, yeah, histories of the reproductive body are still so few by comparison to the significance of the experience. That there are no humans that exist except for the fact of the reproductive body, and yet our ability to historicize that is yet still so nascent. So that's super exciting. Looking forward to that. And relatedly, what are you reading?
oh, so many cool things. Before I talked about the silos of sort of environmental history and history of race and stuff. Now I'm just like blowing up the silo of history itself because because to do this project, I'm thinking about it in such an interdisciplinary way where I'm reading art history and stuff around visual culture, and I'm reading literary studies, because a lot of these images kind of appeared in texts. And so what are the texts kind of saying, and what is their relationship to the image? And looking at sort of stories from different cultures, including indigenous American cultures, classical European cultures, because you have imagery from, and like mythology from like Greek and Roman mythology, but then also origin stories of like Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, like these different ways that different cultures have thought about the nursing women and the roles they're playing. And so I'm reading a ton of stuff, and it's all super interesting because it makes me think about things in all these different ways. I'm not sure it makes it any easier for me to do it. But it's been really fun to read a lot about how different disciplines approach these questions.
That's so great. Is there any one work that you would recommend to all of us, or just say, or that's just at top of mind for you, or that you're just currently like thinking about? It doesn't have to be the best, the most, the mostest. It's not it's just like anything top of,
Thinking about something, I'm like looking on my desk here. I'm like, what have I been reading? What have I been reading? Actually, this isn't, well, I've been reading a few things. I've been looking back. Surrogate Davis was a fellow with me and looking at Invention of the Human Renaissance Ethnography, and then Benjamin Schmidt's Innocents Abroad. So they're kind of approach to visual history. But I'm also looking at Rousseau's Emile, right? And thinking about like, because Emile has all these different editions and all of these different frontispieces, and has all this to say about nursing and women's bodies sort of directly and indirectly. And I've been kind of reading more sort of French, like 18th century French stuff, Crèvecoeur and kind of, the essay, like What is an American, comes from sort of the Letters from an American Farmer. And there's a really different edition in French than there is in English. And those have a lot of resonance with this visual culture, especially because I'm focused in on a 1774 image that comes out of Raynal, a publication sort of attributed to Raynal, the Abbé Raynal, about the French colonial experience. So I don't know, that was a handful.
So interesting. So interesting. Okay, well, thank you. We've got a couple of questions from folks who have joined us. Super interesting. My colleague Tarika says, be interested in hearing more about the yellow fever and malaria arguments, if you could talk about that a bit.
Sure. So that's a great question. So one of the arguments I hear is, well, there are, some African populations who have sickle cell anemia, and that this sickle cell disease and the sickle cell trait makes you resistant to malaria. And so some historians have then said, well, if we apply this to the past, we can say, some Africans had resistance to malaria and no Europeans did. And so and then with yellow, well, okay, I'll stick with malaria for now, and then I'll go into, so this is problematic on so many levels, right? In the first place, there are many different strains of malaria, and they go sort of all over the world. They are actually different strains, and so you can be resistant to one or even immune to one, but not necessarily to all of them. Second of all, nobody in the 17th or 18th centuries used the word malaria or had a concept of this disease at all. And so like almost everything was just fevers. And so fevers could encompass all kinds of things. And so going back and sort of saying, well, I think they must have meant malaria here is really irresponsible, I think, and ahistorical, because how can you sort of diagnose what somebody thought a few hundred years ago? Because if they had no concept of malaria, then they wouldn't have had a concept of immunity to malaria or resistance to malaria. But beyond that, say all of that wasn't even true, right? Say we could go back and say, yeah, look, here's malaria. Right now, I forget the exact number. It's something like 1 in 13 or 14 of African Americans, as high as, right? 1 in 13 or 14 has this trait. We have no way of knowing what the population would have been several hundred years ago who had this trait. It could have been way lower than that, right? But even if we were like, yes, we're going to pretend that that it stayed consistent. If you have a plantation and we're going to say it's 1 in 13 instead of even 1 in 14, and you have 130 people on that plantation, and 10 of them aren't getting malaria. That means 120 of them are. And so you're not looking at that group of people and saying, wow, they're so healthy, right? Like, I mean, obviously not everybody gets malaria all the time, but if you have this small percentage, or maybe it's, I guess it would be more than 10. But anyway, it's a really small percentage, right? If you have 3 times 13 number of people and only 3 of them are resistant to malaria, then you don't look at your population and say, they're so healthy, they aren't getting this disease. And so when you have historians who look back and say, well, malaria, like sickle cell trait, it affects such a tiny percentage of people compared to how many people would be getting sick that it is a nonsensical argument. And then yellow fever is a little bit different. So yellow fever, also sometimes we're just known as fevers. It's a little bit more recognized as like this is a disease. Like there are people who are writing about yellow fever during this time, but they're not differentiating between Black and white people. They are differentiating between strangers or newcomers to a place and inhabitants, like people who have lived there for a while. So if you look at basically almost any record of yellow fever during this time, you'll get a sense of difference between like, well, who has lived here for a while and therefore is not going to get it, and who is new, who's a stranger, because that's who it's going to affect, right? It's not going to affect people who are seasoned to this place. It's going to affect people who are new. And that kind of is pretty consistent in the writings about yellow fever. And it doesn't become a thing. The only time someone mentions Black and white differences is in South Carolina in the late 1740s. This one guy suggested that might be the case, but he publishes it in this obscure, like Scottish publication, and it doesn't gain any traction until the 1790s when Benjamin Rush is in Philadelphia and he's like, oh, I see this thing, it might be true. And then very quickly realizes, nope, that's not true at all, right? All of these Black people are getting yellow fever and dying. And, but for whatever reason, people have really latched on to this very brief period when Benjamin Rush suggested it might be possible and sort of said, oh, see, it was all about Black and white. But none of the other literature from before or after shows that really.
It's amazing, actually. It really is amazing. Like you have located this like source of not just confusion, but obfuscation and distortion. That I mean, it's potently racist, and it just shows us a very different form of how racism is function. It's really, really super interesting that that is like, yeah, so plain. Amazing. Okay, a related question, actually. Someone else has asked a question about mosquito-borne diseases, but I think you've kind of touched on that. But another question, which a long and interesting question, I'm going to just cut to the chase here, which is about, have you thought about what you're talking about in the context of other forms of expertise or expert discourses that racism travels with? For example, like medical racism, and for example, the extensive contemporary literature that suggests that some people, and particularly some races, don't feel pain in the same way, and the extensive literature now showing that physicians had been reluctant to prescribe painkillers for Black folks in the same way they were for white folks. So can you talk about kind of contextualizing the expert discourse you're describing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually, I mean, these are horrible things, but they're like, so I teach, let's see, March 2020, when we sort of all shut down for COVID, and my students at the time, I was at Beloit College in Wisconsin then, were freaking out. And I thought, well, how can I help? Right. And I thought, I'm going to teach a new course on the history of health and sickness and medicine. And I'm going to focus on epidemics. So so I taught it the next fall, and I was like, okay, we're going to look at smallpox in early 17th century New England. And then we're going to look at yellow fever in late 18th century. And then and then we had a whole unit on plantation medicine in the 19th century. And this is, I think, where, some of this starts to harden, right? This idea that like Black women's bodies are experimented on, Black people are like different from white people because their skin is thicker, and that therefore you get the development and entrenchment of these ideas, right? That Black people don't feel pain in the same way, and so they're less likely to be taken seriously by doctors, and that's why today you have a higher maternal mortality rates among Black women, right? In a lot of cases, because it's like their concerns are dismissed, and then at the time the class went up through COVID, and students kind of created their own archive of their experiences, and we talked about race, and we talked about race throughout the class, obviously. And I taught it a couple times at Beloit, and then I came to Montana State, and I hadn't taught it yet because at Beloit I could propose a class, and like 2 months later they'd be like, fine, and here it takes 2 years. So I'm teaching it in the spring, or actually just the winter, since the whole spring term is the winter. But I'll teach it starting in January, and I am really I actually don't teach my work in the class, but I do talk about this through line, right? And kind of talking what I said about the yellow fever epidemic, even in Philadelphia in the 1790s, and the beginnings of these ideas about like if Black and white bodies were different in that sense, and quickly like, oh, nope, not at all. But then how the development of medicine and medical technologies on plantations starts to sort of really kind of okay and totally normalize the idea of experimenting on Black bodies, and sort of saying they're not feeling pain. They go through these kinds of things in the fields all the time, and putting it through today, which is a very sort of long and complicated way of saying, yes, I find these connections really fascinating and fabulous. And I plan to continue teaching about it.
Yeah, and really generative. I mean, that as I was listening to you describe that, it seemed like very much the same logic of taking the book through the majority of the 19th century up into the Civil War to explain how these logics continue to operate, that they themselves can be historically specific, but that doesn't mean that the logic is itself fundamentally different. It's different places and times where it gets applied. So I can see how that, really, really interesting. Is there anything I didn't ask you or that you wanted to tell us that you didn't get to talk about in our last minute and a half? I know.
I don't know. I really think the only, because I've already said this like 7 times. It's just that this take home message to me is sort of like, how can people keep thinking this way? And how can sort of, well-educated and trained scholars think this way? And this goes to your question about like public and private, and I mean, not public and private, like the public and the scholarly side, which is that what I want to do is have scholars who write textbooks and things that are widely read stop saying this kind of without thinking. So that students students don't read textbooks anymore anyway, but if a student were to ever read a textbook or are learning about this in their class, that they start thinking differently, right? And that this is one way of starting to disseminate this knowledge, right, is to undergraduates, because that's a kind of really good intersection between sort of the scholarly and the public.
Absolutely.
The undergraduates, most of them become the public.
They do. And the kind of pundit class is astonishingly influenced by their undergraduate experience. So the kind of loudest voices sometimes in the public sphere, at least insofar as olds like me understand it now, very much shaped by that. Well, thank you so much, Kate. This was a great conversation. I really, really appreciate it. Highly recommend the book. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you, Karin. Thank you.
Have a great day. Okay, bye.